The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Aviation's main hangar when Honor Lopez walked through the employee entrance at exactly 7 a.m., carrying her usual coffee and wearing the same unremarkable maintenance coveralls she'd worn for 3 years. What none of her colleagues knew was that beneath those grease-stained sleeves were hands that had once controlled the most advanced fighter jet in the world. Honor had spent 1,095 days hiding the fact that she was a former F-22 Raptor pilot, pretending to be just another aircraft technician while watching less qualified people make critical decisions about the very machines she knew better than anyone alive. Today, that secret would finally matter. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The Riverside Aviation facility stretched across 40 acres of former military airfield, its collection of hangars and maintenance buildings housing one of Europe's premier civilian aviation research centers. The morning air carried the familiar scent of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, sounds that had become Honor's daily soundtrack for the past 3 years. At 26, she moved through the facility with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood aircraft systems at a level that went far beyond her official job description. Honor's workstation sat in the corner of Hangar 7, surrounded by diagnostic equipment and technical manuals that she barely needed to reference anymore. Her colleagues knew her as the technician who could troubleshoot any problem, who stayed late to ensure every system was perfect, who had an almost supernatural understanding of how aircraft behaved. What they didn't know was that her expertise came from 400 hours of flight time in the F-22 Raptor, the most sophisticated fighter jet ever built. 3 years ago, Honor had walked away from her military career after a controversial incident that had made continuing impossible. The official records showed an honorable discharge, but the real story was buried in classified files that would never see daylight. She'd chosen civilian life over fighting a system that would never understand what really happened during that classified mission over the North Sea. Riverside Aviation had offered her a fresh start, a chance to work with aircraft without the weight of military politics. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her days maintaining jets while watching others struggle with concepts that were second nature to her. During morning briefings, she'd listen to engineers debate aerodynamic theories she could explain in her sleep. She'd watch test pilots prepare for flights in aircraft far less complex than the machine she'd once commanded through combat scenarios. But she kept her mouth shut, her head down, and her secrets buried. Her supervisor, Director Walsh, ran the facility with the kind of bureaucratic precision that prioritized credentials over capability. Walsh had been impressed by Honor's technical certifications and her ability to diagnose problems that stumped other technicians, but he'd never thought to look deeper into her background. Honor had carefully omitted her military service from her resume, listing only her civilian engineering training and technical qualifications. The work itself was satisfying in its own way. Honor took pride in ensuring that every aircraft that left Riverside's hangars was operating at peak performance. She'd developed diagnostic techniques that had become standard practice, written maintenance protocols that had improved safety margins, and solved technical problems that had puzzled the engineering staff. But there was always the underlying tension of watching from the sidelines while others made decisions about flight operations. Her colleagues respected her technical skills, but saw her as just another maintenance worker. During lunch breaks, she'd listen to the pilots discuss flight characteristics and performance parameters, offering occasional insights that were always attributed to her theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. The test pilots in particular treated her with the casual dismissiveness that came from assuming she'd never been higher than a stepladder. Honor had learned to navigate the social dynamics of the facility carefully. She was friendly but not familiar, competent but not threatening, helpful but not presumptuous. She'd built relationships based on reliability rather than personality, earning trust through consistent performance rather than personal connections. It was a calculated approach that kept her secrets safe while allowing her to do work she found meaningful. The most challenging part wasn't hiding her skills. It was watching preventable mistakes happen because the people making decisions lacked the experience to see what she could see clearly. There had been several incidents over the years where Honor's intervention had prevented serious problems, but her contributions were always framed in terms of her maintenance expertise rather than her understanding of flight dynamics.
The morning briefing that would change everything started like dozens of others, with Director Walsh standing before a room full of engineers, technicians, and test pilots to discuss the day's flight schedule. Honor sat in her usual spot near the back, notepad ready, listening to discussions about aircraft she understood better than anyone in the room would ever know. Today's test flights will focus on the new avionics integration system, Walsh announced, referring to the classified military contract that had brought significant funding to Riverside Aviation. We're running final evaluations before the system goes to military testing. Honor's attention sharpened. She knew exactly what they were testing because she'd seen similar systems in development during her military service. The lead test pilot, Captain Reynolds, reviewed the flight parameters with the kind of confidence that came from extensive civilian flying experience. "The integration should be straightforward," he told the assembled team. "We've run all the simulations and the computer models show optimal performance." Honor bit her tongue, knowing that computer models couldn't account for the dozens of variables that only real combat experience could teach. When Reynolds outlined the test approach, Honor recognized immediately that he was planning to push the aircraft into flight regimes that could trigger system conflicts he wasn't trained to handle. The avionics integration was designed for military specifications that operated differently from civilian systems, and the transition points between modes could be catastrophic if not properly managed. "Excuse me," Honor said, raising her hand tentatively. "I've reviewed the technical specifications for that integration system, and there might be some compatibility issues during high-stress maneuvers." The room turned to look at her, and she could see the mixture of mild interest and patronizing patience on their faces. "What kind of compatibility issues?" Walsh asked, his tone suggesting he was humoring her rather than seeking genuine input. Honor chose her words carefully, trying to convey critical information without revealing how she knew it. "The switching protocols between military and civilian avionics operate on different timing sequences. During rapid acceleration or complex maneuvers, there could be conflicts that cause system lag or incorrect readings." Reynolds smiled, the kind of smile pilots give to ground crew who think they understand flying. "Thanks for the concern, Lopez, but we've got comprehensive monitoring systems. If there are any issues, we'll see them coming and abort the test." Honor felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed by someone who didn't understand the limitations of their own knowledge. "The monitoring systems might not catch fast-developing problems," she pressed gently. "The lag time between system conflict and visible symptoms could be too short for safe abort procedures." The room's patience was clearly wearing thin. She could see eyes rolling and hear the subtle sighs that indicated she was overstepping her perceived expertise. "Lopez," Walsh said, with the firm but gentle tone used to redirect overeager employees, "I appreciate your attention to detail, but Captain Reynolds has 15 years of test pilot experience. I think we can trust his judgment on flight safety." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Honor was being reminded of her place in the hierarchy. What stung most wasn't the dismissal itself, but the assumptions behind it. Everyone in that room believed they understood her capabilities based on her job title and her quiet demeanor. They saw a competent technician who was perhaps a bit too interested in systems beyond her area of responsibility. None of them could imagine that she'd flown combat missions in aircraft that made their test platforms look like training toys. After the briefing, Honor approached Reynolds privately, hoping that a one-on-one conversation might be more effective. "Captain, I really think you should consider the system integration warnings. The military specifications for that avionics package are different from anything you've worked with in civilian aircraft." Reynolds' response was kind but condescending. "Honor, I know you're thorough with the technical stuff, and that's valuable, but there's a difference between reading about flight systems and actually flying them. Trust me, I've been doing this long enough to know when something's genuinely dangerous versus just theoretically problematic." The irony was almost painful. Honor had more flight time in advanced military aircraft than Reynolds had in total flying hours, but she couldn't say that without revealing everything she'd worked 3 years to keep hidden. She was trapped by her own secrecy, forced to watch someone make decisions based on incomplete understanding while she possessed knowledge that could prevent disaster. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative.
The weeks following the avionics briefing established a pattern that became painfully familiar to Honor. Despite her technical expertise and comprehensive understanding of aircraft systems, she found herself systematically excluded from meaningful decision-making processes. When Director Walsh assembled teams for critical projects, Honor's name never appeared on the roster. When test pilots needed technical consultations, they bypassed her in favor of engineers with impressive degrees but limited practical experience. The exclusion wasn't malicious, which somehow made it worse. Walsh and his staff genuinely believed they were making logical choices based on qualifications and experience. They saw Honor's maintenance background as valuable, but limited, unable to conceive that someone in coveralls might possess knowledge that surpassed their engineering staff. During project meetings, she watched from the periphery as teams struggled with problems she could solve in minutes. Captain Reynolds became the unofficial leader of flight operations, his civilian test pilot credentials carrying weight that Honor's hidden military experience never could. When new pilots joined the facility, they naturally gravitated toward Reynolds for guidance and mentorship. Honor observed their conversations during break times, listening to discussions about flight envelope management and system integration that revealed fundamental gaps in their understanding. The most frustrating incidents occurred during technical troubleshooting sessions. When aircraft systems malfunctioned during testing, Honor would identify the root causes quickly, but her suggestions were filtered through layers of hierarchy before reaching decision-makers. By the time her insights were presented as recommendations from the engineering team, critical time had been lost and problems had often compounded. One particularly galling example involved a hydraulic system failure that grounded their primary test aircraft for 2 weeks. Honor recognized the failure pattern immediately from her F-22 experience, knowing that the issue stemmed from pressure differential problems in high-altitude operations. She submitted detailed diagnostic reports through proper channels, but the engineering team spent days running theoretical analyses before reaching the same conclusion she'd identified on day 1. When test pilot positions opened up, Honor wasn't even considered as a candidate. The job postings required specific civilian certifications that she didn't possess, despite having qualifications that far exceeded anything available in civilian aviation. She watched less experienced pilots advance to lead positions, while she remained trapped in her maintenance role, her true capabilities invisible to everyone around her. The social dynamics reinforced her exclusion in subtle but significant ways. During facility social events, pilots and engineers formed distinct groups that reflected the organizational hierarchy. Honor found herself relegated to conversations with other maintenance staff, listening to discussions about weekend plans rather than flight operations. When she occasionally offered insights about aviation topics, they were received as interesting observations from someone with theoretical knowledge, rather than expertise from someone with practical experience. Director Walsh's annual performance reviews praised Honor's technical competence, while simultaneously reinforcing her limitations. Her evaluations consistently noted her enthusiasm for learning about systems beyond her direct responsibilities, and recommended focusing on core maintenance skills rather than expanding into areas outside her expertise. The reviews were well-intentioned, but served to formalize the barriers that kept her confined to her current role.
While Honor's colleagues saw her as a dedicated but limited maintenance technician, she spent her off-duty hours engaged in preparation that went far beyond her official responsibilities. Her small apartment near the facility had been transformed into a private aviation research center, with walls covered in technical diagrams, flight manuals, and detailed analyses of aircraft systems that Riverside was developing. Every evening after her maintenance shift ended, Honor studied the latest developments in military aviation technology. She maintained subscriptions to classified technical journals through her veteran benefits, keeping current with advances in fighter aircraft systems that wouldn't reach civilian applications for years. Her understanding of cutting-edge aviation technology remained at the level of someone actively involved in military flight operations, not someone who had left that world 3 years ago. The technical challenges at Riverside provided opportunities for Honor to apply her advanced knowledge in ways that appeared routine but required sophisticated understanding. When she diagnosed complex system interactions or predicted failure patterns, her colleagues attributed her accuracy to exceptional intuition rather than recognizing the depth of experience behind her insights. She learned to present her knowledge in ways that seemed like logical deduction rather than direct experience. Honor's physical training regimen remained at military standards, though she was careful to exercise during off-peak hours when her fitness level wouldn't attract attention. She maintained the reflexes and physical conditioning necessary for high-performance flight operations, understanding that skills deteriorated quickly without constant practice. Early morning runs and evening workouts kept her ready for scenarios that she hoped would never arise, but knew she should prepare for anyway. The most sensitive aspect of her preparation involved maintaining currency with F-22 systems through unofficial channels. Honor had cultivated relationships with former colleagues who still served in active duty positions, receiving updates about system modifications and operational developments through carefully worded conversations that appeared casual but conveyed critical information. These contacts understood her situation without discussing it explicitly, providing the knowledge she needed to stay current with her former aircraft. Her apartment contained detailed technical manuals that officially didn't exist in civilian hands. These documents, acquired through legitimate veteran benefits programs, contained specifications and operational procedures for advanced military aircraft systems. Honor studied them regularly, ensuring that her knowledge remained current despite her 3-year absence from active flight operations. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her secret regimen. Honor practiced mental exercises designed to maintain the quick decision-making abilities essential for high-stress flight operations. She ran through emergency scenarios in her mind, rehearsing responses to system failures and combat situations that civilian pilots never encountered. These mental rehearsals kept her reflexes sharp while providing an outlet for the frustration of being unable to use her skills openly.
Honor's comprehensive knowledge and unusual insights began attracting unwanted attention as her 3rd year at Riverside progressed. What had initially been seen as exceptional intuition started raising questions among her colleagues about how a maintenance technician could possess such detailed understanding of advanced aviation systems. The same expertise that made her valuable also made her suspect. The questions started small, but grew more persistent over time. During technical briefings, when Honor offered suggestions that proved remarkably accurate, other staff members began exchanging glances that suggested her knowledge exceeded expected parameters. Chief Engineer Williams was the first to voice concerns openly, questioning how someone with her background could predict system behaviors with such precision. It's unusual for maintenance personnel to have such detailed understanding of flight envelope characteristics, Williams mentioned to Director Walsh during a staff meeting that Honor wasn't invited to attend. Lopez seems to know things about aircraft performance that aren't typically covered in maintenance training. The observation was presented as curiosity rather than accusation, but it planted seeds of suspicion that began to grow throughout the facility. Honor became aware of the increased scrutiny when colleagues started asking pointed questions about her background and training. They wanted to know where she'd learned specific techniques, how she'd developed her diagnostic abilities, and why she seemed so interested in systems beyond her official responsibilities. She answered carefully, attributing her knowledge to extensive self-study and natural aptitude, but the explanations felt increasingly inadequate.
The situation deteriorated when Captain Reynolds noticed Honor's familiarity with military flight procedures during a casual conversation about emergency protocols. She'd made an offhand comment about ejection seat procedures that revealed knowledge of systems that civilian aircraft didn't possess. Reynolds' subsequent questions about where she'd learned such information forced Honor to claim she'd read about military systems in technical publications. Director Walsh called Honor into his office for what he termed a background clarification meeting. The conversation was ostensibly friendly, but Honor recognized it as an investigation disguised as routine inquiry. Walsh asked detailed questions about her previous employment, her technical training, and her sources of aviation knowledge. Honor provided truthful but incomplete answers, carefully omitting her military service while explaining her civilian qualifications. "We're impressed with your technical capabilities, Lopez, but some staff members have noticed that your knowledge extends into areas that aren't typically part of maintenance training. We need to ensure that all our personnel are properly credentialed for their areas of expertise." The implication was clear. Honor's knowledge was being questioned because it didn't match her official qualifications. The social atmosphere at the facility became increasingly uncomfortable as rumors circulated about Honor's background. Some colleagues suggested she might have undisclosed connections to military contractors or defense companies. Others wondered if she was conducting unauthorized research or sharing proprietary information with outside parties. The speculation was baseless but damaging, creating an environment of suspicion around her activities. The formal confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Director Walsh summoned Honor to his office for what he called a role clarification discussion. Present were Walsh, Chief Engineer Williams, and Human Resources Director Patterson, their serious expressions indicating this was more than routine consultation. Honor entered knowing that her 3 years of careful secrecy were about to be challenged directly. "Lopez, we need to address some concerns that have been raised about your performance and conduct," Walsh began, consulting a file that Honor assumed contained reports about her recent activities. "While your technical work remains exemplary, there are questions about your involvement in projects beyond your assigned responsibilities." The formal tone indicated this was an official warning rather than friendly guidance. Williams leaned forward, his expression stern but not hostile. "We've documented several instances where you've provided input on flight operations, avionics integration, and performance parameters that fall outside maintenance jurisdiction. While your suggestions have generally been helpful, the scope of your knowledge raises questions about your background and training." Honor felt the familiar tension of walking a line between truth and necessity. "Sir, I've always tried to be helpful when I notice potential problems or safety issues. My knowledge comes from extensive study of aviation systems and genuine interest in ensuring our aircraft operate safely." The explanation was honest but incomplete, carefully avoiding any mention of her military background. "That's exactly the issue," Patterson interjected, her human resources training evident in her measured tone. "Your level of expertise suggests experience or training that isn't reflected in your employment file. We need complete transparency about your background, particularly any previous employment that might relate to your current knowledge base." The moment Honor had been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. Walsh, Williams, and Patterson were giving her an opportunity to voluntarily disclose her military service, but she also recognized this as an ultimatum. Continued employment at Riverside would require complete honesty about her background, which would inevitably lead to questions about why she'd concealed her experience. "I understand your concerns," Honor replied carefully. "My aviation knowledge comes from personal study and genuine interest in ensuring our aircraft operate safely." The explanation was honest but incomplete, carefully avoiding any mention of her military background. "That's exactly the issue," Walsh interjected, her military training evident in her measured tone. "Your level of expertise suggests experience or training that isn't reflected in your employment file. We need complete transparency about your background, particularly any previous employment that might relate to your current knowledge base." The moment Honor had been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. Walsh, Williams, and Patterson were giving her an opportunity to voluntarily disclose her military service, but she also recognized this as an ultimatum.
Continued employment at Riverside would require complete honesty about her background, which would inevitably lead to questions about why she'd concealed her experience. "I understand your concerns. My aviation knowledge comes from personal study and genuine interest in ensuring our aircraft operate safely. I've never done anything to compromise facility security or violate company policies." She was buying time while trying to determine how much she could reveal without destroying the civilian life she'd built. Walsh's expression hardened slightly. "Lopez, we're not questioning your loyalty or integrity, but we need to establish clear boundaries regarding your role here. Effective immediately, you're restricted to maintenance duties only. No participation in flight planning meetings, no input on operational decisions, and no technical consultations outside your assigned area of responsibility." The restrictions were delivered professionally, but felt like a punishment for being too competent. Williams added additional limitations. "All technical reports must be reviewed by engineering staff before submission. Any observations about flight operations should be directed through proper channels rather than communicated directly to pilots or operations personnel." Patterson concluded the meeting with what amounted to a final warning. "These restrictions are designed to ensure appropriate role boundaries and maintain operational integrity. Any violation of these guidelines will result in immediate review of your employment status." Honor was being told to suppress her expertise or face termination. Walking back to her workstation, Honor realized that her worst fears about disclosure had been confirmed. Even without revealing her military background, her demonstrated competence had been perceived as threatening to the established hierarchy. The system was actively working to constrain her abilities rather than utilize them effectively. That evening, Honor sat in her apartment staring at the F-22 technical manuals that represented the career she'd abandoned. 3 years of hiding her capabilities had led to formal restrictions that made her feel more confined than ever. She wondered if the sacrifice had been worth it, whether building a civilian life required accepting permanent limitations on her potential contributions.
The emergency alarm shattered the quiet afternoon routine at Riverside Aviation at exactly 2:47 p.m. on what had started as an ordinary Thursday. Honor was completing routine diagnostic checks on a training aircraft when the facility's emergency communication system activated, broadcasting an urgent message that made her blood run cold. A military F-22 Raptor had experienced catastrophic system failure during a classified test flight and was attempting an emergency landing at their facility. Within minutes, the facility transformed into a coordinated emergency response center. Director Walsh's voice echoed through the hangar intercom system, calling all available personnel to emergency stations. "We have an inbound military aircraft with multiple system failures. This is not a drill. All personnel report to emergency positions immediately." Honor dropped her diagnostic equipment and moved toward the main hangar, her heart racing as she processed the implications. The F-22 pilot's radio transmissions crackled through the facility's communication system, painting a picture of escalating crisis. "Riverside Control, this is Viper 2-1 declaring emergency. I have total avionics failure, hydraulic system compromised, and limited flight control authority, requesting immediate emergency landing clearance and full crash response." The pilot's voice remained professional despite the obvious stress, but Honor could hear the underlying tension that indicated genuine life-threatening situation. Captain Reynolds coordinated the emergency response from the control tower, his civilian test pilot experience making him the obvious choice to guide the Raptor to safety. Honor listened to his instructions with growing alarm, recognizing that his approach, while technically correct for civilian aircraft, failed to account for the unique characteristics of F-22 systems under emergency conditions. The Raptor's fly-by-wire controls and advanced avionics required different emergency procedures than anything Reynolds had encountered. "Viper 2-1, reduce airspeed to 150 and configure for straight-in approach," Reynolds transmitted. Honor felt her stomach drop, knowing that speed recommendation would put the damaged Raptor into a flight regime where its compromised systems couldn't maintain stable control. The F-22's emergency procedures required higher approach speeds to maintain control authority when hydraulic systems were compromised. Director Walsh assembled the emergency response team in the main hangar, assigning roles based on official positions and established protocols.
Engineers prepared diagnostic equipment, maintenance crews readied emergency response tools, and medical personnel stood by for potential pilot extraction. Honor found herself assigned to perimeter security, keeping unauthorized personnel away from the emergency landing area. Once again, she was relegated to the sidelines while others made critical decisions about aircraft systems she understood better than anyone present. The approaching Raptor appeared as a distant speck against the afternoon sky, growing larger as it descended toward Riverside's main runway. Through the hangar windows, Honor could see the aircraft's unusual flight profile, recognizing signs of control difficulty that weren't apparent to her colleagues. The Raptor was porpoising slightly, indicating that the pilot was fighting degraded controls while trying to maintain stable approach attitude. Reynolds continued providing guidance to the struggling pilot, but his instructions reflected civilian emergency procedures that didn't apply to military fighter aircraft. Viper 2-1 continued descent and prepare for normal landing configuration. Honor knew that normal landing configuration for an F-22 with hydraulic failures could result in complete loss of control during the critical final approach phase. The radio chatter intensified as the Raptor drew closer to landing. Other aircraft in the pattern were directed to alternative airfields, emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, and crash response teams prepared for potential disaster. Through it all, Honor remained at her assigned perimeter position, watching the approaching crisis while possessing knowledge that could mean the difference between successful emergency landing and catastrophic crash.
Honor watched the F-22's unstable approach with growing desperation, recognizing that the pilot was fighting a losing battle against damaged systems while receiving guidance that made his situation worse. The aircraft was now less than 2 miles from the runway, and every second of delay reduced the chances of successful intervention. She knew she had to act, despite the restrictions Walsh had imposed and the consequences she would certainly face. Breaking from her assigned perimeter position, Honor ran toward the control tower where Reynolds was coordinating the emergency response. Her movement attracted attention from other personnel, but she ignored their surprised looks and focused on reaching the communication equipment. She needed to speak directly to the Raptor pilot before his approach became unrecoverable. "Captain Reynolds," Honor called out as she entered the control room, her voice urgent but controlled. "The approach speed you recommended is too slow for F-22 emergency procedures. With hydraulic failures, the Raptor needs higher airspeed to maintain control authority during landing." Reynolds turned toward her, his expression shifting from concentration to irritation at the interruption. "Lopez, you're supposed to be on perimeter duty," Reynolds replied curtly. "We have this situation under control." His dismissal was automatic, reflecting 3 years of assumptions about her capabilities and role. Behind him, other control room personnel exchanged glances that suggested Honor was overstepping her bounds during a critical emergency. "Sir, I understand F-22 emergency procedures," Honor pressed, stepping closer to the radio equipment. "The approach Reynolds is directing will result in loss of control on final approach. The Raptor's emergency procedures are different from civilian aircraft." The control room fell silent, except for the radio chatter from the approaching aircraft. Everyone present was staring at Honor, their expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism to outright disbelief. Her claim to possess specialized knowledge about military fighter aircraft contradicted everything they thought they knew about her background and capabilities. Reynolds' response was sharp and final. "Lopez, you're a maintenance technician, not a pilot. I've been flying for 15 years and I know how to handle aircraft emergencies. Your interference is dangerous and inappropriate." His dismissal carried the weight of professional experience and institutional authority, making Honor's contradictory claims seem delusional rather than expert. "But sir," Honor tried one more time, knowing that seconds were critical and the F-22 was approaching the point of no return. "I'm trying to tell you that I have experience with F-22 systems. I know what that pilot is dealing with, and the guidance he's receiving is gonna get him killed." Her statement was desperate but truthful, revealing more about her background than she'd intended to. The radio crackled with the Raptor pilot's increasingly strained voice.
Riverside Control, I'm having difficulty maintaining approach attitude. Controls are getting sluggish, and I'm losing authority in pitch axis. Honor recognized the symptoms immediately, knowing that the pilot was experiencing exactly the control degradation she'd predicted would occur at the airspeed Reynolds had recommended. Walsh stepped between Honor and the radio equipment, his expression hard with authority and barely controlled anger. "Lopez, you are hereby ordered to return to your assigned position and remain there until this emergency is resolved. Any further interference will result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges for interfering with emergency operations." As security personnel moved to escort Honor from the control room, she made one final desperate attempt to save the situation. "The pilot needs to increase airspeed immediately and configure for high-speed approach. F-22 emergency procedures require different handling than civilian aircraft." Her words carried across the room, but they were dismissed as the desperate claims of someone having a breakdown under pressure.
Honor allowed herself to be escorted from the control room, but her mind was racing through options as she watched the F-22 continue its unstable approach. The pilot's radio transmissions were becoming increasingly urgent, confirming that Reynolds' guidance was leading toward catastrophic loss of control. With less than 90 seconds until the aircraft reached the point where recovery would be impossible, Honor made a decision that would change everything. Slipping away from the security personnel assigned to escort her back to perimeter duty, Honor ducked into the maintenance hangar where she knew the facility's backup radio equipment was stored. Her 3 years of meticulous observation had taught her every detail of Riverside's communication systems, including emergency frequencies that could reach aircraft directly without going through the control tower. Working quickly, Honor activated the backup radio system and tuned it to the military emergency frequency that F-22 pilots monitored during flight operations. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency across controls that were identical to systems she'd used countless times during her military service. Within seconds, she had direct communication capability with the struggling Raptor pilot. "Viper 2-1, this is an emergency advisory on guard frequency," Honor transmitted, using the call sign protocol that would identify her transmission as legitimate military communication. "Be advised, your current approach parameters are incompatible with F-22 emergency procedures for hydraulic system failure. You need immediate speed and configuration changes." The pilot's response came back immediately, his voice sharp with surprise and hope. "Emergency advisory? Identify yourself and state your authority for F-22 emergency procedures." Honor knew that her next words would either save his life or destroy her civilian identity forever. There was no middle ground and no way to provide the help he needed without revealing everything she'd hidden for 3 years. "Viper 2-1, I'm a former F-22 pilot with 400 hours in type, including multiple hydraulic emergency procedures. You're currently below minimum control speed for your system configuration. Increase airspeed to 180 immediately and configure for high-energy approach." The transmission revealed her military background completely, but the pilot's life took precedence over her carefully constructed civilian identity. "Copy emergency advisory. Increasing airspeed and adjusting approach profile." The relief in the pilot's voice was audible as he began implementing procedures that matched his aircraft's actual capabilities rather than civilian emergency protocols. Honor continued transmitting specific guidance based on her intimate knowledge of F-22 systems and emergency procedures. Meanwhile, chaos erupted in the main control room as Reynolds and Walsh realized that someone was providing contradictory guidance to the Raptor pilot on an unauthorized frequency. Security teams were dispatched to locate the source of the transmissions, while Reynolds attempted to regain control of the emergency response through official channels. "Viper 2-1, disregard unauthorized transmissions and follow Riverside Control guidance. Unknown station providing emergency advisory, you are ordered to cease transmissions immediately." The conflict between competing guidance created additional stress for the pilot, who now had to choose between official facility control and the anonymous voice providing F-22 specific expertise. Honor ignored the order to cease transmissions, focusing entirely on guiding the struggling pilot through the complex sequence of emergency procedures that would allow safe landing with degraded systems. Viper 2-1, maintain current airspeed and prepare for arrestor cable engagement if available. Your hydraulic degradation will require non-standard landing roll procedures. The F-22 pilot made his choice, following Honor's guidance rather than Reynolds' civilian-based instructions. Emergency advisory, I'm following your procedures. Riverside Control, I'm deviating from your guidance based on aircraft-specific emergency requirements. The pilot's decision validated Honor's expertise, while simultaneously challenging the authority of everyone who dismissed her capabilities. Security personnel finally located Honor in the maintenance hangar, finding her seated at the backup radio station, providing detailed technical guidance to the approaching aircraft. Her calm professionalism in handling the emergency stood in stark contrast to the chaos her actions had created throughout the facility. She continued transmitting critical information, even as security moved to apprehend her. Viper 2-1, you're configured correctly for emergency landing. Trust your training and follow standard F-22 hydraulic failure procedures from this point. Honor's final transmission provided the pilot with confidence and technical guidance that would carry him through the remaining approach phase. She then calmly shut down the radio equipment and turned to face the security team.
The F-22 Raptor touched down on Riverside's main runway with textbook precision, executing a perfect emergency landing that demonstrated the effectiveness of Honor's guidance versus the potentially catastrophic consequences of following civilian emergency procedures. The aircraft rolled to a controlled stop using emergency braking systems, and the pilot executed a safe egress without injury or further damage to the aircraft. In the control room, stunned silence followed the successful landing as Reynolds, Walsh, and the emergency response team processed what they had witnessed. The unauthorized guidance from the unknown advisor had clearly saved both pilot and aircraft, while their official procedures had been leading toward disaster. The contradiction between their expectations and the demonstrated results created cognitive dissonance that left everyone struggling to understand what had actually happened. Director Walsh's voice carried a mixture of relief and anger as he addressed the control room staff. I want whoever provided those unauthorized transmissions found and brought to me immediately. This is a serious breach of emergency protocols regardless of the outcome. His authority had been undermined by someone who possessed superior knowledge, and he needed to reassert control over the situation. Honor was escorted to Walsh's office by security personnel, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the administrative chaos her actions had created. She understood that her civilian career at Riverside was effectively over, but the successful emergency landing validated every decision she'd made during the past hour. The pilot was alive, the aircraft was intact, and her 3-year secret was finally revealed in circumstances that demonstrated its value. The debriefing session that followed included Walsh, Reynolds, Chief Engineer Williams, and the F-22 pilot who had flown the emergency approach. Captain Mitchell, the Raptor pilot, provided detailed testimony about the effectiveness of the anonymous guidance he'd received versus the civilian emergency procedures recommended by Riverside Control. The advisory I received demonstrated complete familiarity with F-22 emergency procedures, Mitchell reported. The guidance was technically accurate and potentially life-saving. Without those corrections to my approach parameters, I would likely have experienced loss of control during final approach. His statement provided professional validation of Honor's intervention from someone qualified to judge its technical merit. When Walsh questioned Honor about the source of her F-22 knowledge, she finally abandoned the careful deceptions that had protected her civilian identity for 3 years. Director Walsh, I am a former United States Air Force F-22 pilot with 400 hours of flight time and extensive experience with emergency procedures. I've been working here for 3 years under my civilian qualifications because I needed to leave military service for personal reasons. The revelation created immediate shock in the room as everyone present recalculated their assumptions about Honor's background and capabilities. Reynolds stared at her with undisguised amazement, finally understanding why her aviation knowledge had seemed so comprehensive and her insights so accurate. Williams' expression reflected the dawning realization that they'd been systematically underutilizing someone with extraordinary qualifications. Captain Mitchell's response was immediate and enthusiastic.
Ma'am, your guidance today was outstanding. You demonstrated complete understanding of F-22 systems and emergency procedures. Thank you for potentially saving my life." His gratitude was professional and sincere, representing validation from someone qualified to judge her expertise. Director Walsh struggled to process the implications of Honor's revelation. For 3 years, he'd supervised someone whose qualifications exceeded those of his entire flight operations staff while restricting her to maintenance duties and questioning her competence. The successful emergency landing had demonstrated that her knowledge was not only genuine, but superior to their established procedures. The immediate practical question became what to do with Honor's unauthorized actions during the emergency. She had clearly violated facility protocols and ignored direct orders, but her intervention had prevented potential catastrophe. The conflict between regulatory compliance and effective results created a complex situation that required careful consideration of both immediate consequences and future implications. As the debriefing concluded, Honor sat quietly while the others discussed her fate. She had finally revealed the truth about her background under circumstances that demonstrated its value, but she also understood that her violation of protocols would have consequences regardless of the successful outcome. Her 3-year effort to build a civilian life had ended dramatically, though whether the revelation would lead to opportunity or termination remained uncertain.
The administrative review that followed Honor's revelation lasted 3 days, during which she was suspended from all duties while Riverside Aviation's leadership grappled with the unprecedented situation. Director Walsh found himself managing the aftermath of discovering that his maintenance technician possessed qualifications that exceeded anyone else at the facility, while simultaneously addressing her flagrant violation of emergency protocols and direct insubordination. The review board consisted of Walsh, senior facility administrators, and representatives from the Military Liaison Office who had been called in to verify Honor's claims about her service record. Her military personnel files confirmed everything she had revealed: 400 hours of F-22 flight time, completion of advanced combat training programs, and an honorable discharge following an incident that remained classified at levels above the review board's clearance. Captain Mitchell's detailed report about the emergency landing provided crucial evidence supporting Honor's intervention. His technical analysis demonstrated conclusively that Reynolds's civilian emergency procedures would have resulted in loss of aircraft and probable pilot fatality, while Honor's F-22 specific guidance had enabled a successful emergency landing. The military liaison officer emphasized that civilian authorities were not qualified to direct military aircraft emergency procedures. "The question before us," Walsh addressed the review board, "is whether Lopez's actions constitute gross insubordination warranting immediate termination, or whether they represent exactly the kind of initiative and expertise we should value in our personnel." His internal conflict was obvious, as her successful intervention had potentially saved Riverside from the catastrophic consequences of a crashed military aircraft on their facility. Chief Engineer Williams presented a different perspective during his testimony to the review board. "For 3 years, we questioned Lopez's extensive knowledge and tried to limit her involvement in operations beyond maintenance duties. We now understand that we were systematically underutilizing someone whose qualifications surpass our entire flight operations staff. The real question is why our evaluation processes failed to identify her capabilities." Human Resources Director Patterson addressed the regulatory implications of Honor's concealment of her military background. While Lopez wasn't required to disclose her military service, her decision to hide qualifications relevant to her work here raises questions about transparency and trust. However, given the classified nature of her service and the personal reasons for her career change, her discretion may have been appropriate. The review board also examined the broader implications of Honor's case for facility operations and personnel policies. Reynolds admitted that his civilian experience hadn't prepared him for military aircraft emergencies and recommended that Riverside develop protocols for accessing military expertise when needed. The incident had revealed critical gaps in their emergency response capabilities. Honor's own testimony was straightforward and uncompromising. "I concealed my military background because I needed to build a civilian life free from the complications of my previous service. I violated protocols during the emergency because I possessed knowledge that could save a pilot's life.
and I believed that saving a life took precedence over following rules that would have resulted in preventable tragedy. The military liaison officer's assessment carried significant weight with the review board. Lieutenant Lopez demonstrated exceptional judgment during a crisis situation where civilian procedures were inadequate for military aircraft. Her intervention prevented potential loss of life and aircraft while providing an example of the expertise that civilian facilities need when supporting military operations. Director Walsh struggled with the contradiction between Honor's insubordination and her demonstrated value to the facility. Her technical knowledge, problem-solving abilities, and crisis management skills had been evident throughout her 3-year tenure, but the emergency had revealed capabilities that transformed her from valuable technician to irreplaceable asset. The review board's deliberation lasted 6 hours, during which they weighed regulatory compliance against practical effectiveness, institutional authority against individual initiative, and punishment against recognition. The complexity of Honor's case required balancing multiple competing interests while establishing precedents for future situations. When the board reconvened to announce their decision, Honor faced the possibility of termination, formal reprimand, or unprecedented recognition of her unique qualifications. Walsh's expression was unreadable as he prepared to deliver the verdict that would determine whether her 3-year civilian career would end in disgrace or transformation.
6 months after the emergency landing that changed everything, Honor stood in the same hangar where she had once been restricted to maintenance duties, but now she wore the flight suit of Riverside Aviation's newly created Director of Military Liaison Operations. The transformation had been dramatic, but the path to her current position had required navigating complex organizational and regulatory challenges that tested everyone involved. The review board's decision had been unprecedented. Rather than termination or punishment, they had chosen to completely restructure Honor's role to utilize her unique qualifications. Director Walsh announced the creation of a new position specifically designed to bridge the gap between civilian operations and military requirements, with Honor as the obvious choice to fill this critical role. Her new responsibilities included coordinating military aircraft operations at Riverside, developing emergency procedures for advanced military systems, and serving as technical consultant for projects involving classified military technologies. The position required security clearance upgrades and formal recognition of her military qualifications, effectively ending the secrecy that had defined her civilian career. The facility itself had undergone significant changes following Honor's dramatic revelation. Reynolds had voluntarily enrolled in military aviation training programs to better understand the aircraft systems he might need to support in future emergencies. The engineering staff had implemented new protocols for accessing specialized expertise during crisis situations, and the entire facility had adopted more comprehensive emergency response procedures. Honor's relationship with her colleagues had evolved dramatically as well. The same people who had questioned her extensive knowledge now sought her guidance on technical challenges and operational decisions. Williams regularly consulted with her on complex engineering problems, while Reynolds had become a genuine advocate for her expertise and judgment. The morning briefing that had once excluded Honor from meaningful participation now featured her as a primary contributor. Today's test flights will include military protocol integration, she announced to the assembled team, referring to the expanded contract that had resulted from their demonstrated capability to support advanced military operations. We'll be evaluating systems that require both civilian and military operational expertise. Captain Mitchell, who had returned to Riverside several times for follow-up operations, had become one of Honor's strongest supporters within military circles. His reports about her emergency guidance had led to additional military contracts and recognition of Riverside as a preferred facility for complex aircraft operations. The successful emergency landing had created opportunities that extended far beyond saving a single pilot. The personal transformation had been equally significant for Honor herself. After 3 years of hiding her capabilities and accepting limitations imposed by others, she now found herself in a position where her expertise was not just valued, but essential.
The constant tension between her knowledge and her role had been replaced by alignment between her capabilities and her responsibilities. Director Walsh, who had initially struggled with honors and subordination, now considered her recruitment and development one of his most significant achievements. Lopez represents exactly the kind of expertise that gives Riverside competitive advantages in military contracting, he told visitors during facility tours. His earlier concerns about her unauthorized actions had been overwhelmed by appreciation for the capabilities she brought to the organization. The broader impact of Honor's story had spread throughout the aviation industry, inspiring other organizations to reconsider how they evaluated and utilized personnel with non-traditional backgrounds. Her case had become a study in the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of how it was acquired or initially presented. During quiet moments, Honor reflected on the journey that had brought her from concealed maintenance technician to respected director. The 3 years of hiding her qualifications had been necessary for her personal healing, but the emergency that forced her revelation had ultimately created opportunities she never could have anticipated. Her willingness to risk everything to save a pilot's life had transformed not just her own career, but the entire facility's approach to expertise and authority. The F-22 technical manuals that had once represented an abandoned career now sat openly on her office desk, symbols of knowledge that was finally being utilized rather than hidden. Honor had learned that sometimes the greatest professional risk was not taking risks at all, and that expertise unexpressed was expertise wasted. As she prepared for another day of coordinating complex military operations, Honor knew that her story had demonstrated something important about capability, recognition, and the courage to act when action mattered most. The young woman who had hidden her Air Force background for 3 years had become someone whose military expertise was now essential to saving lives and advancing aviation safety. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.